Hello, everyone, and welcome to to our webinar. This is an innovation studio event, which is a pop-up strand of work that will take place during this academic year. The Innovation Studio is an RCS knowledge exchange project, and my name is Flavia Domingues. I am a theatre director and doctoral candidate at RCS. And it is my pleasure to welcome our speakers today. We have with us Marc Silberschatz. That has just popped up in your camera there. Is the head of classical and contemporary text at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and a theatre director. Marc has directed over 25 productions in Scotland, the United States and England, including Moby Dick, rehearsed, which was the New York Times critics' pick, War of the Roses, an 8-play repertory cycle of Shakespeare's history plays called by Backstage the largest production in off-Broadway history. And just before the lockdown, Marc directed A Winter's Tale or The Child Hath Found Her Mother here at RCS. Well, there at the RCS. Next spring, he will direct Perkin Warbeck, A Mask of Anamnesis, his own adaptation of John Ford's Perkin Warbeck. Marc holds a PhD from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and the University of St Andrews, and an MA with distinction in classical and contemporary texts directing from RCS. Mars Exploration, May 22nd, 1984, is the first piece of work Marc has directed that was not live theatre. Derek Jeck, if you could show us your video, Derek, is from Omaha, Nebraska. He received a BFA in acting from, he received a BFA in acting from Nebraska Wesleyan University, acted in Chicago for a few years prior to joining the MACCT course. And about a year after graduating from RCS, he moved back to Scotland on an exceptional talent visa. Derek is also a member of Glasgow-based theatre company Brief Palava. Welcome, Derek. And we have Dani Nelson with us. Can you show us your face, Dani? Thank you. Dani is an actor and writer living in NYC. And oh, sorry, I'm losing my things here. Dani is an actor and writer living in NYC who graduated from the MACCT course in 2017. She really appeared in the radio dramas As Seen On and Rogue Waves, both available on Spotify. Before that, she performed in Lungs at Stage West Theatre and as Ophelia for the Philadelphia Shakespeare Theatre. Her solo show, April Is Over, received 5 stars at the 2017 Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Today, we also have with us our lovely BSL interpreters, Nicole, who is on screen just now, and Sabine, who will be swapping with Nicole, and they'll be exchanging every 12 minutes. They'll be tapping in and out of the conversation. I hope you can see them fine. And Stephanie has posted the link on the chat for the audio transcription, live captioning available from this event. So hopefully you can get the link there. You might want to split your screen, use a double screen for the captioning and the webinar here. And if you have any questions, if there's any problems, just pop a question in the chat or a comment in the chat, and we can, we hope we can help you. Lovely. So I hope that you have managed to watch the film, Mars Exploration, with or without captions, or both. But even if you haven't, you are obviously most welcome to stay and join the discussion. And if you have missed the link to the videos, I'm going to ask Stephanie if she can post a link to the versions of the both captioned and not captioned on the chats there as well. So they should be available for you to watch after the webinar. We'll start off with a conversation between me, Mark, Derek, and Dani. And we'll do that for about half an hour, and then we'll open the floor for any questions and comments that you might have. So I'm going to ask you to use the Q&A tab that you have on the bottom of your screen there. And you should also know that you can upvote questions that you see if you are curious about the same thing, and that helps bump them up to the top of our screen. We can't really see or hear you if you're just attending this webinar. So please just know that we're not using the hands up function or any sign for you to speak. So please just do make use of the Q&A tab instead. So without further ado, I'll start us off by asking Mark and the actors about the discussions you had, and if there were particularly about integrating BSL and the captioning into this piece, but also other online content, as Mark had mentioned, that this is something that works differently on the screen. And obviously in this world now, everything has moved online. So the same with the captions. So can you talk a little bit about the process that you went through to come up with the solution that you did use for the caption video, please?
Shall I start us off? Because I think that one sort of ended up being me. So I think it's worth saying at the outset, just to sort of frame this up, is at least certainly the way I feel about this is I am in no way anything close to resembling an expert in this medium or in this form. And I think it's maybe useful to say that what we're actually dealing with here is we're dealing with someone in me, Dani and Derek, I don't know if you feel the same way, who suddenly found what I'd been doing for 20 years no longer possible and had to deal with, well, what do I do instead? So rather than this being, at least for me, an expert coming to share expert practice, this is more like somebody stumbling around in the dark trying to come up with solutions just like everyone else. Now, and part of that, we didn't really know what the piece was going to be, I don't think. We had text, we had some sense of it, but we actually didn't know if what it would be, if it would work at all. And I think when we got to a place where we felt like it was working, the immediate thing that struck me was, how do you actually make this accessible? Because it's dealing with quite a complicated soundscape that's also directional in nature, as well as the fact that any appearance of a human being is quite rare and therefore quite loaded as an image on the screen. So even the notion of having it be interpreted felt odd to me, because then you'd have one or two human figures as a constant presence. Now, I'm very lucky in that I've done quite a lot of work with Catherine King, who I think is watching this talk. And whenever I have questions about stuff like this, my immediate inclination is to ask Catherine, because Catherine is tremendous as an interpreter and as an expert in these things. And so Catherine was generous enough to watch the video. And she and I had a conversation about what we could do. Her immediate thought was, no, you can't use BSL for this. It needs to be captioned. And then it became about how do we actually make the captions do something more interesting than words at the bottom of the screen, but also how do we make the captions actually reflect what the content of the piece is, and also make clear what's going on and who's speaking, because you don't ever actually see Dani or Derek say words. So you just have text coming in, so you don't even have the luxury of seeing somebody speaking to know who it is those words belong to. At that point, it then became about just trying to figure out how we could do the things that we ultimately did. So we played with positioning quite a lot more than I think you would normally see. Color to differentiate what's going on. Size to try to at least create some sense of inflection or to reflect some of what Dani and Derek were doing. And once you start playing with that stuff, you start realizing you can have more fun and you can start make things trail off the screen and whatnot. So it became a bit about trying to reflect, really trying to reflect more of what Dani and Derek were doing than would be possible with just words at the bottom. Because Dani and Derek did, I thought, some really extraordinary work, and I wanted the quality of that work to register in some way, not just the words they were saying.
Wonderful, thank you. I wonder if before I ask Derek and Dani if you want to add anything to that. I was thinking when I watched the videos to ask you if it's fair to say that the caption video removes some of the mystery of the background at the beginning, in particular, before we start hearing the characters' voices, because I watched the video without captions first, and there were quite a lot of sounds that I couldn't quite identify. But it just added to that aura of what is going on and where are we. But when you get the captions, it tells you exactly what the sound is. So yeah, I'm wondering how you feel about that, and if there's any other way that we can think of about conveying that there was background noise, but without being that specific about what the noise exactly was, to keep that mystery going.
I think we thought about that, and Catherine and I spoke about that. I think the challenge becomes that when you have long stretches of virtually no visual stimulus, dark stretches and things like that, if you aren't actually, I think if you're not hearing the audio, it becomes very easy to disengage or to lose what's going on. I was concerned about the fact that some of the sounds aren't really identifiable in the uncaptioned version, but I think on balance, not being able to think of a better solution, clarity and communicating what is going on seemed more important than preserving a mystery, because we're already, I think, with this piece walking a fine line between an ambiguous mystery and lack of clarity. And I would have worried about, by trying to preserve that mystery through the captioning, we would have tipped right over the edge into lack of clarity altogether. Though I think
That's
actually,
fair.
Dani and Derek,
Sorry,
since
go
you
on.
sort of didn't know, or you did your work and then probably saw the captions when they went live, it'd be interesting to know your reactions to the captions, especially as related to your work.
Yeah, I think, as you said, Derek and I weren't really involved in the decision of how to make this accessible in this way. But one thing that, speaking about the sort of mysteriousness of the sort of mysterious nature of this project, I think one experience I had as a performer in reading the text initially, of course, the spoken text is all from the transcript from the CIA, but Marc, in his adaptation, had written all these beautiful descriptions of images and sounds that were so evocative and so visceral. And so in the uncaptioned performance, as you said, we get hints of these things, or we get images of these things. But I felt that watching it again with the captions actually brought me back to the sort of poetry that Marc wrote. So what you're sort of exchanging in mystery, you're getting this sort of poetical journey that I think is also really rich and really informs the transcript.
Lovely, thank you, Dani. Derek, did you want to add anything as well?
When I first put it on, I thought I had clicked on the wrong link, because it just, YouTube, I think, just automatically put on captions. And yeah, there were just like there were some background noises that I wasn't sure what they were beforehand. And then it got clarified, and I was like, I thought that's what it was. But I ended up turning them off because, as Marc says in the description, it's sort of a guided meditation. And that sort of like having to like read, well, just having something there to read kind of like took me out of like the meditative state that the sort of oral landscape put me in.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, I thought that that was really interesting, and it's as I have had conversations about this with Catherine as well. It's just the process of translation. It's almost impossible to keep everything, to keep the poetry and keep the mystery and keep the clarity. So it is a super interesting process, and I do commend you for what you eventually managed to do with the captions and the directional sounds. Dani mentioned though the descriptions of the images as well. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about that, about the process of choosing, curating all the images that went with the text. So if you could speak a bit about that, Marc, please.
So I think there are probably 4 sources, broadly speaking, of images for the text. There's footage I shot, there's footage Dani shot, there's footage Derek shot, and there's footage that is royalty-free, attribution-free, Creative Commons 0 footage from a couple of different websites. Now, I actually don't know too much about what Dani and Derek did, because we just sort of had a conversation about what was needed, and then they went off and did their thing and sent me things. What was interesting to me, though, is that, when I was working through the adaptation of the script, because to me, one of the things about the piece is that, there are actually quite a few more experiments that were done on remote viewing, and most of them are very prosaic. You can find them in the CIA's declassified reading room online is like the happiest CIA website ever. It feels like a sort of early 2000s vernacular, very conversational, but you can find quite a huge number of transcripts, and almost all of them seem to have been with the intent of being verifiable. So it would be, we want you to view Yankee Stadium on Tuesday at 10:03 a.m. because in theory they could then have somebody there on Tuesday at 10:03 a.m. to check accuracy. Once you designate the planet Mars in the year 1 million BC, you're no longer looking for accuracy because there's no way you can verify that. So what it immediately seemed to me is that whatever journey is going on here is as much a journey inward as it is a journey outward. So for me, what I tried to do is I basically tried to shut off any kind of editorial mind, at least for the first few drafts, and just write whatever images seemed to come up, trying to sort of almost work through an almost automatic writing. And then there was a bit of an editorial process to look at that, but I sort of left them there with the view saying, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to find this image or this thing like that. I can't possibly shoot that under lockdown, and no one's going to have that available. But I figured it would be a placeholder, and then I'd find something else. And remarkably, as I searched these 2 websites, I think I found 95% of what I'd put in the script, because someone had done something or had done something close enough to it where if I searched, I think at one point I searched creepy hallway, and you can see there's a video in the video, there's a creepy hallway. So these were not even sophisticated searches. They were just whatever words I thought of. And then it was just a question of plugging them in and trying to make them work. Along then with the video that Dani and Derek shot over a few days after the conversations. I think I'll shut up and let them talk a bit about that process because I actually don't know what they did. I just liked what they did.
It was very interesting because everything that I shot was in a bathroom, and it felt so weird to just be there in there by myself and just sort of using what Marc had described as the images he saw, and just like spending 5 minutes at a time recording just like doing whatever. It felt so silly. But yeah.
I think it's easily done. And yeah, Dani, could you let us know a little bit about your images, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what was a very exciting challenge about getting this material is that when Marc sort of was asking for these images, he was being specific and like visually what he wanted, but I think more so he was asking for a certain feeling, particularly for the character of Sub. yeah, so trying to achieve the feelings that he was describing, like, you know, like that lazy Sunday in you know, morning, lounging in bed, not a care in the world, like that's more of an experience that you're trying to evoke. So luckily I was in lockdown with my videographer slash suite partner, who was able to help me capture some of that, and then went out into the city as well. Yeah, very lucky. Went out into the city as well and got some of them, but it was definitely very interesting. It was, not as like concrete or specific as you might think. It was very trial and error, trying to get at that feeling that Marc had described to us.
Lovely,
I feel like
you.
I should offer one little credit where credit is due thing here. Derek's video, one of the things that he did that we discussed was, I think, Derek, am I right that you actually shot through a glass of water, or sort of like a glass container of water, which caused some of the distortion on his face. Now, I would love to be able to take credit for that idea. But the person who I borrowed it from is actually also in the chat right now, because I actually saw that trick done on a live Zoom performance that was created by a CCT student, Raymond Wilson, for a piece called Open Lock and Strife. And the effect was I just thought it looked really cool, and so when it came time to do this, I felt like that might be useful. So Raymond, thank you for that. I did borrow that, and I do want to and credit where credit is due, that I we'll say borrowed something that I saw you do and thought worked really well.
We're always stealing from each other. That's what artists do, isn't it? Or borrowing, if you like to use, if you prefer to use the term. Also on that note, that you're talking about how you sent some instructions to the actors and got them to go off and find these images. There's two things that I am dying to talk about here, and one is about a little bit more about the process of directing the actors remotely, and also about all sorts of thoughts and conversations you've had about theatricality in this medium, because this is the big thing in the pandemic age, isn't it? What separates film from theater or from a YouTube video? So if you have, what were your thoughts when you're creating the piece, and how is it theatrical, and how the actors remotely? So we'll do two in one there.
I think if I could jump in with the theatricality question, and then maybe I'll let you two talk about the rehearsal process a bit first. I was thinking about the theatrical question because, for me, I never thought of this as a film. That was never really what it felt like to me. And I think what I've come to, and this is something I only realized after the fact, is that if I think about the difference between live theater and film, well, there are lots, but the one that I think is relevant here is, for me, a question of labor, and labor specifically on the part of the audience. My experience when I watch a film is the imaginative work has been done for me, and so I then am able to absorb and engross myself and immerse myself in that sort of cinematic world. When I go and watch a play, no matter how much money has been spent on the set and how much time has been spent, you're always going to see the strings. You're never going to have that. I don't, at least, ever fully have that immersive experience. But I think that's what makes live theater its own medium, because as an audience member, I'm doing work. I'm finishing the picture, in a sense, or it's happening somewhere between the stage and me, is where the actual art is going on. Not being a film director, and very much missing that, I think, for me, even if it wasn't fully conscious, a lot of what ended up happening in this piece was about ways of introducing more labor for the audience. We had, I think, fairly detailed discussions about what story we were working through, without really ever trying to make sure that the audience got every last detail of that story. And I'm certain no audience member would have gotten every last detail of the story we were working through. But with enough there that suddenly engaging with the piece almost requires requires work, because you will have to start to construct some kind of narrative some kind of something to sustain the piece for half an hour, because we've not joined up those dots the way we might do in more conventional storytelling. So yeah, for me, the theatricality was very much in the labor that we're asking of the audience. Because actually, I would say if you weren't willing to or interested in doing that labor, I don't think you'd watch much of the piece. I think you turn it off and just feel like there's nothing going on here. So I think for me, that's the interesting challenge online, is to actually pick out, well, what of theatricality are we trying to save? And I actually think some of the things we try, like the liveness, live Zoom performances can work very well. But I actually think they work best when there's extra labor involved. So, when we just have a bunch of heads on the screen, I find that less interesting, and it doesn't really hold my attention. When suddenly we're seeing, only fractions of people, or we're seeing very things else, and suddenly I'm having to work to figure out what I'm seeing and how that connects, I feel more like I'm watching a piece of live theater at that point. So for me, that's where the theatricality comes in, is actually in the demand placed on the viewer. Dani and Derek, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or if you want to talk about the rehearsal process a bit, because I sort of drifted into that with the narrative question.
Take it away, Derek.
So I've done a number of online things during lockdown, and this was one of my favorite, just because with so many of them, you have to fuss over where the camera is, you have to do so much fussing over just the technical stuff, kind of. And this one, it was really nice to just kind of we'd have our headsets on, and we could just listen to each other and just kind of focus on the acting just through voice and listening, and not worry about too much else. And that was one thing that I really liked about this project.
Thank you. Dani?
I think it is a really interesting question that all theater artists are having to really wrestle with right now, of what will become of our industry and what will become of our craft, and what kinds of stories are we going to be able to tell, and in what way. And I think that, I won't speak for myself, but I imagine both Marc and I were kind of in the midst of that when Marc came to us with this project. And I would follow Marc to the ends of the earth, I trust him implicitly, but I think it was particularly when he described this project as being something sort of different, as I think the words you used, Marc, were that it was going to live between the ear and the screen, that it was in this sort of liminal space, which I thought was just such a great description of the way that we all feel right now, living in this liminal space, and what kind of story might we be able to tell in that space, which is, I think, challenging and exciting, and does something that I also have done a lot of these Zoom readings and Zoom performances. And I think that they work best when they are very intentionally aware of the medium. And I think that this project takes that to the next level of not just being aware of what we're doing, that we're not doing a film, and we're not doing a Zoom piece, and we're not doing live theater, we're doing something else, but really pushing what that could be. And I think that in the rehearsal process in particular, as Marc said, we kind of created, the three of us, a sort of subtextual story that allowed us to go on a journey in the rehearsal process. And some of that comes through in performance, some of it, no audience member could ever pick up the details of that. But for us, I think it really informed the choices that we made, and the emotional journey that these characters go on. Might seem like a strange thing to say for this project, that they go on an emotional journey, but I think that they really do.
I think it makes sense. I think it makes perfect sense. Sorry, Marc, go on.
I should say as well, I'm thinking about if anybody is sort of either in the process of or about to sort of make that shift and make a first piece online, particularly if it's recorded rather than live. I do want to share one sort of particular experience I had at a certain point that I found really, really destabilizing at the time, but it was completely understandable. And I think it's because my background is so fully in theater. There's an expression that I can't remember where I read about filmmaking, which says a film gets written 3 times. Once when the screenplay is written, once when it's shot, and and a third time when it's edited. We recorded everything, and And for me then, in terms of my own subjective experience of the journey, sitting down to start the editing process was sort of like how I would feel going into tech. But also completely different, because when you go into tech, you've spent 3 weeks, 4 weeks figuring out what it is, and tech is about sort of making that work, realizing that. But actually with this process, I went into the editing and I still had no idea what it was, and realized actually that it was going to become what it was at that point. And so I had this really uncomfortable feeling like I was in tech, having no idea what show I'd made, which for any theater director would be an absolute horrific thing. But I think that was a big shift in my focus, to realize actually that's a key difference, particularly for people who work in live performance, at least for me to be aware of, is that what feels like tech in a process like this is actually a third rewrite of the material, and you won't know what you have until you actually do it, and then redo it after you've finished it the first time and realized it's not working.
That's a very useful tip for everyone trying to make this work out there. It's a really interesting parallel as well. Yeah, when you said they're going into tech without having much of an idea of the show, I had a little heart attack here. But yeah, I totally get what you mean. I'll ask you one more question before we go to the Q&A and have a look at what we have there, and that's about the theme. So I think obviously it's interesting and very intriguing, the declassified CIA documents. So I want to ask, what if it was the feeling of isolation and wanting to be somewhere else, brought about by the pandemic, that made you choose that as your source material, or if it's something that you've wanted to do for a long time. And also piggybacking on that, if given that we're working with this medium now and with exploring different technologies for the format, do you think that we're going to see a bigger surge in sci-fi theater coming on?
I'm deliberately not going to speak first because I've fallen in the pattern of always being the one to speak first.
Okay, we'll go to the actors then. Either of you.
I'm so many fantastic questions. I know that Mark and I had talked about this transcript a while ago, and Mark had sort of told me that he had been really interested in this story, in this historical fact, and what implications it has, and what there might be around that topic to explore. But this was pre-pandemic, and I think that at the time, and I don't want to speak for Mark, but that he hadn't quite found the medium, and so when everything happened, it was sort of this light bulb moment that maybe this is actually a real opportunity to dive into this, and it sounded to me like a good opportunity as well. And I think that there was something in rehearsal really remarkable about recording this from home, right? Like, I'm in New York City on Zoom with Mark and Derek, who are in Glasgow, and we're creating this piece of theater, and there's a very real sense in which we can't be anywhere but our homes. And so it created this really like insular, almost like claustrophobic experience that I think really informed the performance. And then I think, speaking to sci-fi, I think that there is something really appealing right now about, if it were possible to astrally project, to remote view, to be somewhere else at some other time that's not here. But I think that what this piece really brings up as well is like the freedom of that choice, that there's the problem already of being isolated, but when it's because we have to be, because we don't really get to have the choice to be elsewhere, obviously for safety and to save other people's lives. But regardless, I think having that choice taken from us can be really alienating and terrifying in a way. And I think that these characters sort of explore this idea of like, who gets to decide where your mind goes, who gets to decide what you're thinking about, who gets to decide what you know and what you don't. And I think that those are rife with possibility for more art. I don't know. Derek.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about people drifting towards sci-fi with the medium, but that kind of makes sense to me. And I kind of want, on the one hand, I want to see some people really lean into that and go all out, and on the other hand, I kind of want to like see people go completely against that and like go for like, I don't know, high fantasy or something instead. Um, but yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I think I might challenge the premise slightly of a drift toward science fiction. Um, and the reason I say that is actually one of my favorite authors, who is a science fiction writer, made the argument, and I think it's a well-made argument, that if Homer, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and we could go on and on, were writing today, they would all be members of the Science Fiction Writers Association. That actually, this notion of, his argument, the notion of sort of kitchen sink realism is actually the new kid on the block, and pretty much all of our, for most of our recorded stories, actually today would be classified as science fiction or fantasy or speculative fiction, all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the idea of a drift towards sci-fi is maybe not so much a drift as maybe we're just calling it what it is rather than calling it something else. I think for me, the lockdown and the pandemic certainly played an impact, because the only words of mine that exist anywhere in the piece are the title cards at the very beginning. And the one that I remember feeling that was right was the one that just says, even when confined. And I never made too much of that other than just to know that that was there, and that was one that felt like it was going to stick out a little bit, or at least draw attention to itself in the time we're in. But yeah, I think for me, there's something about the lockdown. There's something about this question of, I should say that actually, if you read the transcript, there's nothing in the transcript as sinister as we played it, at least on the surface. There are little hints of things that are sinister, like, you know, you're electrically nulled out, and the voltage reversal. Also, the timestamps in the transcript are actually longer than they are in our version. I think that transcript is about an hour in its original form, based on the timestamps we get at various points within it. But what struck me as being of interest is you have essentially one person who has, if we take remote viewing as a fact, just as we, for argument's sake, say that this is really happening, who has an extraordinary amount of freedom, but is also being effectively controlled by somebody with significantly less freedom in the fact that they cannot do that thing. So there was immediately this almost parasitic, symbiotic thing going on between this sort of interrogator and subject of the experiment that felt interesting. It felt to me like that the monitors, I think it's called Mon in the transcript, to me felt like somebody almost who wants knowledge but doesn't want to pay the price for it himself, who wants it through someone else. The other question that came up then is, why would someone subject themselves to this? What makes a person want to hand over control of their mind to another person? And I think that question sort of fed the subtextual plot that we carried through the piece. I think the only thing I'll say is that I ended up having a conversation with a friend who I'd showed the script to, and he was very, very insistent that I was about 6 years too late to do the piece. And his insistence on it was that the piece doesn't work in the era of Donald Trump. It works in the era of Obama's second term, when everybody was a bit complacent. And I couldn't have disagreed with him more about that. And it took me quite a while to get to a place of saying, well, then what's the piece about if I think it actually has relevance when we're not in a complacent place feeling like, you know, governments are there for us and everything like that. And I think what I came back to was this notion of almost trying to dramatize what I would call almost like an epistemological war that's going on. I'm not going to get too far onto my soapbox about politics, but it seems to me that what we see, particularly with the populist right, and we've been seeing it over for a while, is they've almost grabbed the tools that progressives used to use, particularly in the postmodernist movement, like there's no such thing as an objective truth, everything is a matter of perspective, everything is relative. Those tools were there, I think, were developed to try to bring more voices into the discourse and try to allow space and allow recognition for more voices. I think where we almost let ourselves down is that then when reactionaries took those tools and said, but if there's no objective reality, then we can have Fox News and One American Network, and we can appoint somebody from the Daily Mail to run Ofcom, and everything like that. And this whole question of, and you see it now with things like fake news. And so for me, there's this idea of, that was running through, that's been in my mind for a while, is that once we somehow, the progressive project seems to need to find a way to address the fact that the foundations it was built upon have been co-opted by a very regressive movement. But the war is actually over what we see, what we hear, and how we understand the world, and what we're told. And that's a question of propaganda and everything like that.
Yeah, so the themes are not just relevant because we're in this lockdown pandemic situation, but they are relevant because of the political situation, the political setting that we're living at the moment as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you. Sorry, I just cut you short a little bit because
I was running on. It's fine.
The questions, we have 3 questions in our Q&A box. So we have a question, some similarities between the test subject's imagery and Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles from 1950s-ish. Do you think she made it all up?
Well, I think one thing that's important to know is that the subject in the experiment didn't know they were being asked to view the planet Mars in the year 1 million BC. The envelope was sealed and wasn't opened until after the remote viewing session. To me, that's one of the little interesting things, in that, it does recall plenty of what I would call sort of second or third rate sci-fi tropes, not to besmirch the Martian Chronicles, but there are definite tropes in there that exist. But for me, what's interesting is that this wasn't a case that someone was told remote view Mars and then came up with this stuff. They came up with this stuff, and then later it was found that it was the planet Mars in the year 1 million BC. On the other hand, I'm not convinced remote viewing is a thing. So in that sense, everything of it would be made up. So there's a real question of how reliable is anything that is disclosed in the piece. Dani, I don't know what your thoughts particularly are about that, since you had a lot of the Martian text.
Yeah, I think that's like a very important point to bring up, that the subject did not know that it was Mars, or did not know that it was 1 million years BC. And I think that it was really the way that we explored the text in rehearsal that opened up to me some possibilities of, I think what we tried to do in rehearsal was, why might someone who does not know where or when they're being sent, why might they say these things? And I think that there's a million answers to that question. For me, I think it was less interesting in sort of a sci-fi way, and more interesting in a archetypes of the human subconscious way, and what images, what stories, what characters sort of present themselves to us when we are in a very high stress, traumatized state. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of time, and I want to get through as many questions as possible. We have, since we're talking about Dani's character, we have another question here saying, for me, the style and process you used really worked for the material, and enjoy the feeling of almost being plopped into Dani's character's head. If you could make a version for a theater space, would you? And if so, how would this version influence how you did that?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I have in my notebook a list of projects that are sort of things that I'm interested in doing, and this one's been on that list since 2017. I think one of the fortuitous things about it was that I could not figure out how to make this into a piece of live theater. I felt like there's something interesting in the transcript. I had so many really stupid ideas about how to do it that would have been awful, just awful. I went back and looked at some of my notes, and they were just ridiculous. So in some respects, actually, the fact that we were in a lockdown where live theater is no longer an option, and where at some point, almost in an act of sort of desperation, said, okay, so of all these projects, are there any that I could do right now? And I came to this one, and said, actually, this one might be something that could be done right now. So yeah, I'd make a piece of live theater if I could figure out for the life of me how to do it in a way that was actually good. Right now, I can't.
Derek and Dani, do you have any ideas of how you would work with this in a live space, a physical space?
Just off the top of my head, it almost seems like you could kind of just do what we did do, project the images and the video and whatnot over the stage, and honestly just have sub lying there or whatever. And I think there was some implication that the Mon was coming and like injecting sub with things, and you could just like kind of do that throughout. I think you could have them both like microphoned or something, so that you kind of still have that intimacy that I feel like we had just doing, being able to listen to each other so closely. Yeah, I don't know if that'd be good or not, but that's what first comes to mind.
We're just brainstorming. We're not putting a funding application just now. Lovely. I'm going to move on to the next question. Speaking of politics, well done all. I liked the science fiction genre, and your explanation of demanding a lot from the audience made sense looking back on the piece. What about this story feels most important to tell right now? And as a white male director, do you feel a responsibility to expand the possibilities for women and BIPOC actors? Apologies, I don't know if that's the correct way of pronouncing the acronym. Yeah, so do you feel the responsibility to expand the possibilities for women and actors of color? Mark, I think that's a question for you.
Yes, and I'll take the second half of that first. Absolutely. I think it's essential, but I also think it's essential that it be done in a way that is ethical. And I'll explain what I mean by that. This project didn't start out as something that was necessarily going to be shared with anybody. It was very much, hey, let's try and experiment on this and see if we can find something. And if we have something that feels like it works, we can find a platform for it at that point. So the things that I knew about the project is that it felt like it needed American voices because of the nature of the source material. And then it became about who are actors that I know who I can ethically ask to do this experiment for no pay, just as a playing around activity, who are also American. Now I know quite a lot of actors, but actors who I felt like we had the type of relationship where I could say, hey, do you want to work for free for 4 days? And if we have something, great. And if not, well, then we just messed around for 4 days. What I didn't want to do was put out a general casting call for an unpaid piece of work and things like that. Because actually, when we're talking about opening up opportunities, if you're not paying somebody and you don't have that type of relationship where you can just sort of play around, then you're entering into territory that arguably takes you right back to exploitation. So my answer is absolutely yes. For this project, from the pool of actors with whom I have the type of relationship that I could ask, Dani and Derek were the right people to engage with. But certainly, that's a responsibility for myself and for I think everyone in it to recognize massive historical imbalances, massive historical inequity, and do what we can to work through it. each project is unique, each project is its own entity. And so the question that needs to be asked with each project is, how in this project do we do that? What is the best way? Can we do that in this way for that project? Next project I do will be a totally different, will have it be different circumstances, and there'll be different answers to those questions. I'll pause there because I don't want to over talk. And maybe I'll let Dani and Derek start with the what's the most important part right now. And I may join in with something after they offer something.
If it just wants a refresher of the question was, what about this story feels most important to tell right now?
Yeah, I think we've spoken to that a little bit throughout the course of the discussion about what things are important, in this political moment, what things are important in this global health moment. I don't know that I have anything super innovative to add, and I know that we're crunched for time. I don't know if Derek, you have anything else you want to say?
I don't know that I have much else to add to that either.
That is grand. I think that is fine. We have another question from Eddie saying, any actor who's worked with you, Marc, knows that in the physical space, your rehearsal process is extremely intense, physical, and relies on having bodies in space and sometimes in close proximity, obviously, which is something that is difficult to do currently. So how did the three of you navigate not being able to use that process that you have all worked with as you weren't working in the room physically?
By killing darlings, is the honest answer. Eddie, you'll know this. I've got a process that works for me and works in terms of live theater, but there's no way you could engage in anything like that process over Zoom. It just wouldn't work. And so it again becomes a question about trying to be something that it's not. And so the first thing that I realized I had to do is I'd say, yeah, that process, it's great. It's not happening at all in this project. It's just not going to work. And then it becomes about, a couple of things. Number one, having excellent actors helps, because then a lot of times we can just do a take and I can say, oh, that was awesome. Could we try that? Could you try it this way? Or could we try that? It became in some ways a much more conventional process than I might normally use. But again, when you've got good actors, it makes directors look better. So most of what came out that worked is very much more about Dani and Derek's excellent acting instincts and work than about anything special I did in the process.
I would say for me personally, I think I work from more, my process is much more internal to begin with. And I am familiar with Marc's very physical process, and that actually is not something that has always resonated with me, though I do love working with Marc. And so this was, for me, it was just like, it just, heightened the internalness of it and just really opened up the listening aspect of acting.
Yeah, I'll speak so briefly. I think that that's really well put, Derek. I think listening is like the word I would use to hallmark this performance experience, was really having to be so attentive to definitely whatever Marc was feeding us, but really attentive to each other as well. And I think that there's a way in which the process was similar to doing a film or something, in that you can do many takes of something and explore different things for the same line, back to back to back to back, and have that build on itself as well. And I think that the big difference was that Marc, as a theater director, was really good at giving us that sort of story or journey from moment to moment, and helping us fill in those gaps that maybe we would be able to fill in the space together, but because we don't have that space, Marc was able to create that space sort of magically around us so that we could fill it just with our voice.
I think the other thing with the takes thing is worth noting is that with theater, you want to rehearse it enough to the point where you feel like you're going to be somewhat consistent every night. Not the same, but you're going to give a consistent performance, which means, that whole journey becomes internalized and you own that journey. And actually, with something like this, I realized very quickly that wasn't the target. I didn't need Dani and Derek to be able to do it 6 times really well. I needed them to do it once or twice really well, and maybe not even all of it exactly as it was, because I could clip it together in editing. And so that was the other thing to recognize, is actually, in some respect, weirdly, it allowed more spontaneity to be incorporated in, even though it's now totally fixed. Because if Dani or Derek did something really interesting and spontaneous, it didn't then become a process of trying to make that happen again, or find that again, or find a way to make that if we wanted to keep it. We had the recording of it, and if we wanted it, that could go in. So in some respect, that was actually really freeing, in that we could play with variety a bit more, because there wasn't that goal of, let's make sure we know what we're doing so we can do it every night.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, a final question, which is quite lovely before I send everyone away, is, do the members of the panel have any sci-fi theater pieces that they particularly enjoy?
I don't think I would have a ready answer for this if Marc hadn't said that awesome thing about how Shakespeare and Marlowe, if they were writing today, would be sci-fi writers. I have always been very influenced and inspired by the work of Samuel Beckett. And I think if anyone watching this has not seen Beckett's piece Play, they did it for Beckett on Film, starring Alan Rickman, may he rest in peace. It's on YouTube and Vimeo, 16 minutes long. And I think it's extremely topical, very relevant, explores a lot of similar themes to Mars exploration, about isolation and about the stories that we tell ourselves. So I think that would probably be mine. Play by Beckett.
See, I wanted to let you go first, Dani, because I would have been tempted to say Beckett as well. Because again, Beckett is somebody who would almost certainly fall into that category, where if you actually look at what, when you've got people living in urns and everything like that, you're in that territory. But actually, I'll offer a slightly different one, which is Exit the King, Ionesco. So technically theater of the absurd. But again, particularly the version I saw, because I did see, I think, the Broadway revival of it years ago, which was Jeffrey Rush and Susan Sarandon and Lauren Ambrose. And actually, I would say that probably carries more, or sits closer to science fiction, particularly as science fiction is being explored today, than might otherwise be acknowledged. So it's a little bit of a cop-out to not, take a piece that explicitly identifies itself as science fiction. Oh, wait, I haven't seen it, but I'll give you the play. There's the Honeycomb Trilogy by Mac Rogers. These are 3 science fiction plays. They were written for off Broadway, so they're written to be done very low budget, chronicling the invasion, rebellion, and repulsion of a race of bee-like aliens taking over Earth. That sounds very much like a B movie, but the writing is really extraordinary. And
the person who asked the question just posted in the chat that she loves the Honeycomb Trilogy.
So yes, I'd actually recommend that. I'd recommend a lot. Mac Rogers tends to do a lot of stuff in science fiction, and I'd recommend checking him out. Thank
you. And Derek, did you have one?
Well, I was also going to say Samuel Beckett. I'm kidding. Nothing's coming to mind. Like I can think of like some plays that are science fiction, but I don't know that I'd say they're like my favorite. I'm just gonna pass on this one. Yeah,
that's fair. But as I said, maybe it's something that we'll see more of in the classical sense of what is science fiction. The last one I saw was Solaris at the Lyceum a few months ago. Someone else is saying, Stephanie say Copenhagen by Michael Frayn, or is it science fiction? I think that we'll need a second webinar to just discuss what is sci-fi theater. Lovely. I would just do a quick wrap around. I'm just going to ask Marc, Derek, and Dani to plug anything they have coming up. I know that Derek has something on tomorrow, so could you just quickly tell us what it is, when and where to watch you?
Yeah. So I'm part of a company called Brief Palava. We're based in Glasgow, and one of our members, James Burke, has begun writing some scenes for a play about Ernest Shackleton and his expedition to the South Pole. And so a group of us have been sort of reading those scenes over Zoom, and we've recorded those sessions, and we're going to edit together some clips to share tomorrow. The best place is, as you'll notice in the chat, is to just go to Brief Palava's Facebook page, like and follow us, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Dani, do you have anything coming up?
I do actually, and it's also very science fiction-y. I had the pleasure of being on a radio drama podcast called Rogue Waves. It's on Spotify and anywhere podcasts are available. The premise is it's like 5 years from now, and if anyone who has had COVID became a zombie, so it's very like zombie apocalypse. Very well done, and I play Trace in the finale episode, which comes out next Friday. So yeah, all 8 episodes are about 20 minutes long. Great radio drama. A really good example of people who are trying to make the most of this situation and create really cool art. So yeah, I'll put the name in the chat, but you can find it on Spotify.
Lovely, thank you. And Mark, do you have something?
Well, nothing for myself. My next project is will be in the spring, which is the Perkin Warbeck adaptation, which will hopefully be back to live theater. But I will plug, and it's a few months away now, but in January, the current cohort of classical contemporary text students will be doing their On the Verge projects. They'll all be making online performance in some form. So rather than just one piece that's grappling with these questions, there'll be several pieces from a very talented group of people. That'll be available through RCS in January. So watch out for that for quite a bit more online work.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you to everyone who attended today. If you want to keep up with what the RCS Knowledge Exchange Department are doing, you're probably best to follow us on Twitter. So that's at RCS_the exchange. I'm just going to put it in the chat just now. You could use hashtag Innovation Studio to share your comments about today's conversation. And yeah, that's the most up-to-date information about upcoming exchange events will be shared on Twitter. So thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you, Stephanie, for organizing this. Thank you so much, Nicole and Sabine, for the interpreting. And thank you, Dani, Derek, and Mark for chatting so many interesting things with us and for making the piece. And I will let you all go and do something pleasant with your evening now.
Thank you, Flavia.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.